Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Chris Camaro channel. Today I thought we'd do something fun for a change and go a little bit off topic. Not really though. I mean, this channel's all about technology and mostly automotive, but this is definitely engine related and it's pretty cool, and lots of guys enjoy, cutting a tree up with a nice gas-powered chainsaw, especially something as old as this vintage is. So I thought I'd do a fun little video telling you all about chainsaws and what I've learned about them, and how to enjoy them the most, because they are a little finicky, especially if they're old. But the old ones, in my opinion, are the best ones, and if you can get around their quirks and nuances, then you can really have a lot of fun with these things and get a lot of work done at the same time. So this particular chainsaw is a nice one. It's a Canadian-made Pioneer P20. Very old. It's from the mid-70s, and a lot of these saws that are still around today work just fine. They're built much higher quality, or they're built to last. They're built better than the crap they make today. And these things are over-designed, these old ones, so they tend to be pretty beefy and guttural and dirty and just fun to use. So let's talk a little bit about what makes a two-stroke and what makes these gas chainsaws so unique and fun to play around with. So basically, a two-stroke engine, if you're not familiar, it has half the number of revolutions to produce a power stroke as a normal four-stroke engine would have. They kind of combine everything all together, so you've got this rush of air passing through the cylinder with both the intake and exhaust ports open at the same time, and that rush of air kind of flushes out all the exhaust, and at the same time it brings in new gasoline. And then it closes off, and you get a power stroke, and that's kind of the super simplified version of it. Most of these, pretty much all of them, have a choke, which is basically used to starve the engine of air so that it will have nothing to suck from except from the gas line. So inside here is a carburetor, and carburetor is basically a mechanical metering system that mixes the air and the gas together. And when you pull the choke out, you can see that it closes off this butterfly valve, which prevents any air from entering, and that way the gas line, which is connected through the center of the carburetor, is the only place to suck from. So when you pull the ripcord here, when you turn the engine over and it starts to turn the cylinder is going to try to draw something from the carburetor, but because it can't draw air, it's going to draw fuel. And this is how you get the thing started, because you need to get fuel into the cylinder, wet the cylinder, get the fumes going in order to get it to pop and to turn over. And then of course after that, then you'd be running very rich, so then you'd back this off, and then you'd let the air in, and then it would sustain itself. This whole thing is basically a pump, and there's like rubberized diaphragms inside here that kind of flap around, in response to the engine turning over, and that's what draws the fuel in. It sucks it in and pushes it out. It's kind of like your lungs. If you think of your lungs as a set of diaphragms, it's very similar inside here. It's like breathing with these flexible materials and pushing the fuel through there. And of course, you have to have it tuned right and everything. But basically, that's kind of the essence of how these things work. And I should mention that unlike four strokes, where the exhaust is not super duper critical, with two strokes, the way that they function the best, or at all sometimes, is that you need to have a tuned aerodynamic circuit, a tuned intake, a tuned exhaust. Everything has to be properly measured, and the openings have to be the correct size. It's all very delicate balancing act of airflow. So unlike in a four-stroke where you could probably remove the exhaust and it wouldn't do anything, this one here happens to be loose because some of the fasteners are missing. So you'll notice that the thing is going to rev really high, but that's going to sacrifice a lot of low-end torque, because the torque is actually, it requires an exhaust pathway to produce these back and forth air pulses or shock waves that go back and forth through the exhaust, and that's what actually helps to scavenge some of the exhaust out of the cylinder. So the exhaust is really part of the tuning of the whole system, and you need to have your exhaust clear of debris. Like sometimes they have a restrictor, what do you call it, a spark arrestor screen inside there. That's for safety. You can take that out if your jurisdiction allows for it legally, and it will free up some extra horsepower. But essentially the cavity inside here is tuned to allow the air pulses to go back and forth properly and to suck that gas out properly. So if it's loose, make sure that it's sealed on there, and if it's dirty, clean it out and make sure that it's nice and clean and working properly. Similarly up here with your intake, this is an improvised filter. You shouldn't do this. Get yourself part number correct filter. If you can't, you're going to have to improvise something like I did. But basically, you need to have good filtering, not only to prevent wood chips from getting into the saw, but also because you need a bit of restriction on the intake as well. It's kind of counterintuitive if you're a car guy, but yeah, you need a little bit of suction going on here, because all your tuning is going to be sort of assuming that there's a filter in place. If the filter isn't in place, you're going to have to readjust your carburetor and it may not run properly. So do everything according to the assumption that you're going to have a filter on there. So maybe now I can talk about your basic startup procedure. So generally what you would do is you would, like I said, you'd pull the choke out. Some saws, not this one. This one has what's called an easy arc system. It's very nice. It's got like a feature where it will automatically produce a leak in the cylinder. Right? Like it's allowing the compressed air resulting from the cylinder rising to just bleed out of the engine. And what this does is it makes it easier to start, because the compression makes it hard to pull the cord. If you've got good compression, you'll notice a lot of resistance when you try to pull the cord, okay? So this bleeding feature, this easy arc system, alleviates the effort that you would normally need to start the thing by producing a leak. And then once the engine gets going, then the valve automatically closes itself off so that you get proper compression. But at that point, it's no problem anymore because you've already started it. So, but some saws have a separate thing like this, separate plunger like this, where you pull it out and it does the same thing. It's just manual. Like it'll manually produce that leak, and then you can start the thing up, and then you can push it back in once it's started, and it'll restore that compression. But in this case, it's automatic. And you've got your trigger here. This is your throttle. It moves this this throttle shaft here, and this is what controls the amount of air that actually gets into the engine. It's not the choke. The choke is another type of air control, but this is the one that gives you your power when you press the trigger. And then this is a trigger lock, so you pull this down all the way and you push this in and you let it go. You let the trigger go, that is. And then this will lock it at around, I think, 25% throttle. I think that's what it is. Although it doesn't really look like it. It looks more like 75%. But anyway, it locks it in a higher throttle position than just idle. And the reason for that is, like, when you're trying to start the thing cold, it's usually going to die pretty quickly unless you have some throttle applied. So this prevents you from having to have your finger there while your other hand is busy pulling the ripcord. You can't do too many things at once, obviously, so you need to do that. So you would, depress the trigger and lock that in, have the choke all the way out, pull several times until you get the engine, until you hear the engine turn over by itself. It'll probably pop once or twice, and then it won't. Like, don't pull it after that, because if you continue to pull it, you'll flood the engine with too much gas, and then you'll have trouble starting it after that. So you want to pull it until you hear it pop and turn over a couple times, then stop, and then push this in, I would say, not all the way, but like half position, something like this, and then try to start it again. It should fire up immediately, and then once it fires up immediately, then you can kind of gradually just push this in until the butterfly valve's all the way open. You won't see the butterfly valve, but by knowing that this is full out and this is full in, you're just going to kind of put it in the middle and then push it all the way in slowly until it's stable and running properly. Now, over here you've got the kill switch. It's got two positions, an on and an off position, obviously. This is just your This is just a switch that either connects or disconnects your electrical, which is to say your spark plug. Your spark plug is over here on this side. That's what this boot is for. So basically, there's two types of ignition systems. There's electronic ignition, which uses solid state chips to produce a spark, and there's the older, which most of these saws have, the older points and condenser type system. And a points and condenser type system basically means you got a capacitor inside here, and the capacitor will store up the charge of the magneto with the there's a flywheel inside here, and there's a magnet on the flywheel, and as the engine's spinning around and the magnet passes by, there's a coil that it passes by, and the act of that electromagnetic induction, from the magnets, flying by the coil at a high speed, produces a high voltage, and then the capacitor will store that voltage. And then there's this kind of teeter-totter kind of mechanical mechanism inside here, and it rides on the shaft, and there's a feature on the shaft like a bump, kind of like a camshaft in a sense, and as the thing's spinning around, this bump will cause this little teeter-totter thing to go up and down, and there's a little piece of steel on the bottom of this teeter-totter that will come in contact with another piece of steel. So basically it's opening and closing a circuit, allowing the capacitor to release the stored energy when it touches, and when it's not touching, the capacitor can store the energy. So when it touches, it discharges all the energy in the capacitor through the spark plug, and you get your spark. These points and condenser systems, they get corroded over time, just from oxidation and from use as well. So every few years, every couple of years or so, you will need to service that, and that's not something that most people want to do themselves, although it's not impossible. It's doable. I prefer not to do it myself, but it can be done. It's not that hard. You just have to remove the flywheel to get to it usually, and that's kind of a pain in the ass. And then you just have to sand the tips so that there's no corrosion on them. But be that as it may, that's how those old systems work, and you just need to service those from time to time. But when they are serviced and working properly, you can just put this to the on position, and I'm going to put the cover back on here. And there, not quite. Come on. There. Okay. Good enough. So now I'm gonna start this thing the way I told you, and we'll see about I'll basically just demonstrate the proper way to start this thing. Of course, make sure that the thing has gas and oil in it. There's two reservoirs in this. One's for gasoline, one's for chain oil for the chain to lubricate that. You don't need the chain oil to start you don't need the chain oil to be in there to start the engine, but of course if you start the engine and run the saw without chain oil, it will bugger up the chain and it'll wear out the clutch and everything, so don't do it. Just fill them both before you start off, and then basically we're going to go from there. So just a second here and I'll demonstrate. Okay, so as I mentioned before, you got to make sure that the switch is in the on position first. Pull the choke all the way out. Fluids are in place, and fluids are full and all that. Everything's good. The filter's on, and then you're just going to pull the cord several times until you hear the engine pop or turn over, or whatever you want to call it. Basically, turn over under its own power, and then don't pull it anymore after that. Oh, and yeah, make sure the trigger's pulled in and the trigger lock is in place. Okay, so you saw that the thing turned over quite a few times actually under its own power. So at this point, it's pretty much primed and ready to go. So I happen to know this saw. I know how it runs. So I'm going to just pull the I'm going to push the clutch, or sorry, not the clutch, the choke. I'm going to push the choke all the way in, as opposed to putting it halfway. If your saw is different, you have to know your saw. You have to play with it enough that you know how it behaves. But in my case, I don't think I'm going to need to put it halfway. I'll just put it all the way in. And then once I pull the ripcord one more time, it should start. And once it starts, you can depress the You can pump the trigger a couple times to get it to rev, which is the fun part of using chainsaws. I like that part. But once it seems like it's stable, you should be able to let it go, and it should just idle on its own. You should just be able to leave it there, and it'll just idle. And then to shut it off, you just hit the switch, and the kill switch, and will turn the chainsaw off anytime you want to turn it off. Okay, the thing's so powerful it actually broke the it broke the torque free on the little screw that holds the filter on. It's pretty funny. So now let's talk about a couple of other things that are definitely relevant to chainsaw owners. So one of the biggest issues that people talk about with chainsaws is, what type of oil should I use? How should I mix my oil? What ratio? And whether I should use synthetic or conventional. All these different things. I've done a ton of research on all of this, so I'm just going to sort of bring all of that information together for you and make it all concise and summarize it all so that you don't have to go searching around the internet and reading conflicting reports from different people. So just a second, and I'll grab the oils and we'll talk about that. Alright, so let's talk oil. So let's get the boring shit out of the way first. We'll talk about the chain oil. So I don't know, that you can use all sorts of different types of chain oils. There's nothing really too special. I like this Husqvarna X-Guard Premium All Season. I live in Canada. It's a cold climate, so they do sell oil that's for winter oil. It's got like different viscosity, and it's more appropriate for lower temperatures. But I think all season is fine if you live in a temperate climate. I mean, right now it's summertime. It's mid-20s Celsius, that is. So I don't want to have to change oils all the time, and I didn't have a problem with this stuff in the winter, to be honest. It was below zero, and I didn't have a problem with it. So it's X-Guard Premium All Season bar and chain oil. It's got a special type of tack to it. It's called like a tack modifier or something. Basically, it just means it's sticky like honey or something. So it's not just gonna drip off the chain. It's gonna want to stick to it. In fact, if you have your oiler, opened all the way up, sometimes you'll actually see a spray of oil flying off the chain when you have the chain spinning. If that's the case, it either means that you got too much oil coming out, in which case you need to adjust your oiler, which is usually a little screw or something. You can just sort of adjust how far open it is, or it means that you're using the wrong oil. If you're using like regular motor oil, it just doesn't have the tack and the viscosity and the thickness to stick to the chain, so it's just going to fly off. So this stuff is specifically designed for chains, and it's good stuff. Now let's get to the fun stuff. So the actual oil that you mix with the gasoline. So for the oil that I mix with the gas, here's what I use. AMSOIL is one of the best oils that you can get. So this is pretty much the best of the best. It's full synthetic, 2-stroke oil, and it's designed specifically for power equipment. So there's like 5 or 6 different types of AMSOIL 2-stroke blend, and this stuff is exactly made for chainsaws and weed whackers and things of that nature. So get this stuff. They say you can use it at 100 to 1. I would never run it at 100 to 1, but they have a very good additive package, which is the reason why I bought this. So it's going to be an ingredient in my oil, even if I'm not going to use it exclusively, and I'm not using it exclusively, and I'll explain why. Synthetics are made in a laboratory, and they're uniform in the sense that all the molecules are the same size. It's a very pure hydrocarbon. Conventional oils, not so much. You've got various different long chain molecules mixed in with the short chain ones, and you've got different clearances between metal parts, and sometimes the metal parts will grow as they get hot, reducing the clearances, and when they're cold they're larger. So having a variety of different molecules with different chain lengths is advantageous in an engine where nothing is ever constant. and you know, if you read about this, you'll probably get somebody who will explain this better than I just did. But basically, I like to blend conventional oil with my synthetic. This is actually already blended. This is partial synthetic blend formula, so it's not ideal. I mean, I could use a different type of oil, but this is just cheap stuff. This is MotoMaster conventional or synthetic blend oil, and I mix 2 parts of this with 1 part of that. I'll explain that in a minute. But basically, I want the conventional oil with the long chain molecules blended with something that has a really good additive package. And that way I've got kind of the best of both worlds. And the other benefit to this stuff is that smells really good when it's burning, produces a little bit more smoke too. This thing claims to be pretty smokeless, and I think that takes a lot of the fun out of it. So I like to combine them, and then you get the best of both worlds. You get the nostalgia of driving go-karts as a kid and smelling that 2-stroke oil, and you get the additive package that this thing offers, which will keep your saw running a lot longer. So now, as for the overall mixture, moving on to the gasoline part, I guess, don't ever use any gasoline that's got alcohol in it, so ethanol. No E15, no E85, none of that shit. Just straight gasoline. Generally speaking, higher quality, higher octane, top tier gasolines should be gas only, but I have found this not to be the case. A lot of the times these gas stations will actually use alcohol, or they'll use ethanol to raise the octane level so that they can get 91 or 93 or whatever. So you have to be careful. I know for a fact that Shell V-Power 91 contains no ethanol, so if you don't want to guess about what you're buying, just buy Shell V-Power 91 octane and you'll be fine. There are a few reasons why you don't want to use ethanol in your fuel. Number one, it changes the air-fuel ratio. It actually lowers it, and this is not a big problem. It just means you have to retune your carburetor. So that's kind of a lame excuse, but it's one reason that you'd want to have a fire and forget device, so you just use gas and it's always the same fuel ratio. The bigger reason is that alcohol or ethanol or whatever, it's hygroscopic. Hygroscopic means that it absorbs water. And if you absorb water into your gasoline, it spoils the gasoline, for one. So that means you can never really leave the gasoline in the saw for very long. You have to sort of empty it out after each use or whatever, because if you leave it sitting there, it'll eventually spoil the gas. Number two, it will actually create a corrosive mixture with the water. So when it mixes with water, it creates an acidic compound that will actually eat away at the components in your saw, particularly the fuel line. It will corrode the rubber hoses. It'll corrode the not corrode, but it'll degrade the rubber in the hoses, and it will also degrade the rubber that makes up these flapping components in your carburetor, these diaphragms in your carburetor. It'll dry them up and make them brittle, and then your carburetor won't pump anymore, and you'll wonder why your saw doesn't start. In fact, this just happened to me because I lent it out and somebody put alcohol gas in it, and then when it came back, it didn't work. And the carburetor had just been rebuilt like 6 months ago with brand new gaskets. So I know that's a problem with the ethanol. So avoid it if you possibly can. If you're going to run with ethanol, fine, but you're just going to end up changing all the rubber components on a regular basis and putting stabilizers in your gas if you want to keep the gas, or just replacing it altogether. It's just not good, so don't use it. Moving on to the most important part that we started this conversation on, which is the oil ratio. So as I was going to say, old saws, and the older the saw, the more this is true, used kind of looser engineering tolerances when they manufactured the pistons and the cylinder and all that stuff, when they honed the cylinder out. So the pieces, they fit looser than they do in modern equipment, where they've got very accurate CNC controlled machines and very tight tolerances and all this stuff, right? So with a loose fitting engine, you want to actually have more oil, because you're going to have more friction from the components being out of round, or not perfectly aligned with each other, and there's going to be more grinding and rubbing and that sort of thing. So you need more of a film from the oil to cushion that. And not only that, not only is it something that you need, but it actually increases horsepower, because the thickness and the viscosity of the oil actually contributes to the sealing effect between the piston and the bore. So a richer mixture is actually going to give you more power. And this has actually been demonstrated to be true in scientific studies where they took castor oil and run it through a saw that was on a dyno at different ratios, and they found that going all the way down to 20-to-1, it actually continued to increase horsepower. There's a certain caveat to this. First of all, newer equipment with tighter tolerances, it's going to end up bogging the engine down to have a richer mixture. So those ones tend to prefer leaner mixes, like maybe 40-to-1 or 50-to-1. I've got a weed whacker that I just bought. It's Weed Eater brand weed whacker that I just bought like a couple of years ago. New equipment, basically. And that thing doesn't like, the same ratio that this does. So I run it at around 40-to-1. This saw here, I run it at around 30-to-1. But a lot of people will tell you, you cannot run it lower than 35-to-1. It just won't run. People on the internet will tell you this. They'll say it's physically impossible to start the engine and run it less than 35-to-1, or it'll just, it'll be gurgling and making all sorts of problems. It's not true. It's not true. You can run this thing a lot richer than 35-to-1. I've run it richer than 30-to-1, no problem. If you watch YouTube, you'll see that there are other guys out there who run their saws way down to 20-to-1. I'm not that bold to run it that rich. I think it runs pretty happy at 30-to-1. But then again, this saw's in pretty decent shape. If it was in shittier condition, if it was even more worn out than it is, maybe I'd run it richer. But it's quite happy at 30-to-1. You just have to tune it so that it will run at that ratio. And I'll get into the tuning later, but this saw only has a low speed screw. A lot of other saws will have a low and a high speed screw. So you can actually adjust both the top and the bottom end. If you cannot adjust the top and the bottom end, you pretty much have to stick with what the manufacturer suggests. And believe it or not, this saw here recommends 16-to-1, okay? Now, that's not this stuff. Back when it was 16-to-1, back in the 70s, they just used SAE 30-weight motor oil because they didn't have two-stroke oil. So again, the properties of the oil are the other factor involved here. You're using modern oils. You can't run quite as rich as the manufacturer suggests. If you read right on the cap here, I don't know if you can see it or not. Where is it? Here. I don't know if I can get the angle right, but basically it says, 16-to-1 there. It's upside down, but it says 16-to-1. So you can run 16-to-1 if you're running the old stuff. If you've got a bottle of this old shit laying around, you can run 16-to-1. But if you're using this stuff here, Motormaster or Amsoil, it's not going to like 16-to-1. So I run it at 30-to-1. Now that's between the two. Like that's the total ratio, 30-to-1. So that means 30-to-1 is equivalent to 90-to-3. If you multiply by 3, it would be 90-to-3, right? So what I do, I just round everything off. I pour 100 milliliters of gasoline in a measuring cup, so 100 mils of gas, and I got one of those little plastic pitot tube things, those little squeeze eyedropper things, and I use that to measure actually 3 milliliters, and I put 1 milliliter of this to get those nice properties from that premium oil, and that's actually equivalent to 100-to-1, and it says you can do 100-to-1 with this stuff. So just by that alone, I'm already set. I'm already safe. But then I put an extra 2 milliliters of this. So 1 plus 2, 3 milliliters, 100 mils of gas. That's 3 to 100, which is about 30-to-1 approximately. A little bit off from that, but pretty much. And it runs just great. Like I said, you can run it lower. You can probably run it from about 25-to-1 on this stuff, and it'll still run. You could run it as high as 50-to-1, and it'll still run. I wouldn't do that, though, because it will kill the saw if you run it that high. Don't run it any higher than 40-to-1, in my opinion, really. Other experienced saw users will tell you this. If you're running old equipment, use a rich mix, because if you run a lean mix like you would run in your modern weed whacker, it will kill the saw after a while, just because you can't have these sloppy tolerances in a saw and have such a pathetic film strength, to hold up against the heat and everything, especially if you're chopping a lot of wood with it. So just don't do that. So for tuning, disassemble your muffler, take the screws out, open it up, have a look inside, clean out any crud that might be in there, clean out the exhaust port of any wood chips and shit in there. If you're allowed to take the spark arrestor out, take it out. It frees up some horsepower. Bolt the thing back down so it's not loose as hell like this thing is. Intake, air intake. Yeah, try and buy yourself a new filter if you can get your hands on a new filter. If you can't, you'll have to use like either mesh or cotton, like some sort of cotton sheet or something. Maybe an old T-shirt or something. Actually, old T-shirt, 100% cotton. If you cut that up, that wouldn't be too bad. Make sure that's nice and fresh and covers everything up. Your tuning. So here you got your throttle. All right. You'll notice there's a little needle that's contacting that. It's actually sort of like it's got a triangular tip on it, or a conical tip on it, and tightening that screw, pushing that screw in, will actually, the cone tip on there will actually push this further out to the left, further to the left. This is your idle screw, so it permanently sets the minimum travel of your throttle, so it prevents it from going, to zero basically. So what you want to do when you're tuning this is start the saw. Screw this in, that is to say tighten it, until it pushes this throttle out to the point where your chain is moving, okay? You want your chain to be, you want the clutch, the centrifugal clutch in the saw to be turning the chain basically, all right? So once it's spinning, cut that off, all right? Leave it there. Then you got this screw down here. This is your low speed. It's got an L there, okay? Other saws will also have a high-speed screw, but this one just has a low-speed screw, so I'm just going to deal with this basic scenario. So once you got the thing idling at such a speed that it will cause the chain to start to spin, then you want to turn this thing with a flathead screwdriver. You want to turn it both clockwise and counterclockwise, and you try to observe the sound. Listen to the sound, watch the chain. When you turn it counterclockwise, you're opening it up just like a garden hose, okay? And that's going to add more fuel. It's going to richen it. When you richen it too much, it will start to chug. It'll be like, and it's not going to want to run. It's going to want to stall out on you, okay? Once you get to that point, turn it back the other way, clockwise, and then keep turning it clockwise until you have sort of, the RPMs should go up significantly when you lean it out. So when you start leaning it out, it's going to run away from you, and then it's going to start to die. It's going to be a different phenomenon. It's going to sound a little different, but it's still going to sound like it's about to die. So once you get it to there, you want to monitor how much you had to turn it clockwise in order to get it there. And then you want to remember how much you turned it and then turn it halfway back. So halfway between when it's stalled at both conditions. Once you're at halfway, turn it a little bit more counterclockwise just to be on the rich side, okay? Once you have it there, the chain may still be spinning at that point, so that's fine. What you want to do is you want to go back to your idle again, turn that the other way, so loosen it, bring it out, and you want to keep doing that until the chain stops spinning. Once it stops spinning, that's where you want it to idle. You don't want the chain to spin when it's idling. You also don't want the thing to stall out. So keep turning it until it sounds like it's going to stall out, and then bring it back somewhere in between where it looks like it's going to stall out and where the chain was spinning. Bring it around midpoint. And that's set for your low. If you have your high, first of all, if your low side is set properly, when you hit the trigger, it shouldn't go wah wah wah. It shouldn't make this kind of hollow sound. If it makes this hollow sound, it means there's not enough gas, because when you pull this trigger, it allows a surge of air to enter the cylinder, but ahead of the gas. The gas comes later. It's a lagging indicator. So first the air comes in immediately, then the gas follows. So if it's already lean, it's going to be super lean when you pull the trigger. So you want it to be a little bit rich so that when you pull the trigger, it's got plenty of fuel left over that it can wait for the fuel to catch up and it won't, you know, try to die on you. So if you've set your low speed properly, pulling the trigger like that should be nice and responsive. It should rev immediately. It shouldn't make any weird sounds. It should just rev right away. When you hold this all the way down, now you're in full throttle, wide open throttle. You want to hold it down, and at the same time, so maybe hold it down with your right hand, and with your left hand, use that screwdriver to tune your high side. And again, you're going to want to do the same thing with the high side. You want to turn it counterclockwise until it seems like it's slowing down. You want to turn it back clockwise until it speeds up significantly, and then sounds like it's about to die. And then you want to hit halfway, and then you want to go a little bit further than halfway on the rich side, okay? And it's even more important to do this on the high side screw, on the wide open throttle condition, because if you are on the lean side, you will destroy the engine. It will over rev, it'll overheat, and it'll blow up. So not so much of an issue on the low side, but on the high side screw, make sure you're on the rich side of, you know, right down the middle, and that'll be quite happy for the saw. Depending on the oil ratio and depending on you know, the RPMs and other factors, you may see some smoke. Totally fine. Don't listen to people who say that if it's smoking, it's no good. If it smokes, so what? You know, that's two-stroke. It shouldn't be smoking excessively. It shouldn't be spitting out oil. But a little bit of, you know, translucent smoke is certainly not a problem. So that's how you tune the saw so that it's nice and happy. And don't forget, too, that after you run this thing for a while and it's warmed up, so to speak, it will take a different tune than directly the moment after you started it. So if you start it and tune it immediately, that's not the greatest thing. Like, let it run for a little while and then tune it. You can also, you know, rev it a bit, you know, just to get it through the RPM ranges and, you know, loosen it up a bit and get it nice and happy before you start tuning it. This is always a good idea. Next thing we're going to talk about is troubleshooting, because as much as I love these saws, they do occasionally break down. But the thing I love the most about old equipment, and saws are no exception, is that they just don't die. I mean, no matter what you do to break these things, they always repair. Like, you can always fix them, whereas new stuff, often it's just completely toast and you just have to throw it in the trash. But these things here, it's like they caught COVID or something, and then they go to the mechanic, and the mechanic says, you know, get plenty of rest and drink some fluids, and then, you know, pretty soon it's chopping wood again, and it sounds like you're shoving Home Depot down a kitchen carburetor or something like that, and it's just like purring beautifully. I mean, that's what I think purring beautifully sounds like, obviously. But anyway, so lots of things can go wrong, but it kind of boils down to the same basic premise in terms of diagnostic troubleshooting and how you go about your diagnostic troubleshooting. So any engine requires four things: fuel, air, spark, and compression. So going in order here, fuel, your carburetor is the most important part of that. It has to be working in tip-top shape in order for your saw to run properly. It is basically a metal body with a bunch of these rubberized diaphragms inside, as I mentioned before. The rubberized diaphragms will eventually wear out or basically get hard and inflexible, and they just won't flap properly or pump properly. So you'll have to rebuild the carburetor every couple of years, which basically just involves removing these two screws here, pulling the whole body off, and then there's two plates. There's a plate here and there's a plate on the other side. 4 screws holding those plates on. You just remove those, and there's rubberized diaphragms inside that you can get for like $5-6 online. You can get a replacement kit that's got the new diaphragms, and you just take the old ones off and put the new ones on. These are gasket like things, right? And then just screw these back on, reverse installation, put it back in. It's really not that hard. It sounds intimidating, and I was intimidated by it, but once I did it a couple times, it really is quite simple. So that's a critical part of your fuel system that has to be maintained once in a while. Otherwise, the saw simply won't start. It'll sound like it's just struggling to start, and eventually won't start at all. This fuel hose, which feeds the carburetor, goes through this hole and into the gas tank. And on the end of it is a filter. The filter could get clogged, so you'll have to replace that from time to time if there's garbage in the gas. The hose itself gets brittle and cracks and sometimes just disintegrates just from chemical attack, especially if you're using alcohol gas. So don't use alcohol gas, but even if you don't, eventually this thing will degrade after several years, and you'll just have to unscrew this, pull the whole thing out, go to your hardware store, buy yourself a new fuel hose. They sell fuel hose specifically for this purpose, correct diameter and everything, thread it back in there, and you're good to go. That takes care of the fuel. And of course, like I said, make sure your reservoir is full of good 91 octane gas. Don't get 87, don't get 89. Has to be at least 91 octane, no alcohol, blended properly with the correct ratio. I suggest 30 to 1 with, I suggest, again, a mixture of synthetic and conventional. If you don't want to get the MSO, no problem. Just make sure you get a synthetic blend and you're okay. So that's fuel. Compression has to do with the condition of the saw. If the saw is broken, there's nothing you can do about compression. If it's in good condition and the rings seal and everything like that, the way you can tell is when you try to start the thing. When you pull on this, if you pull it slowly, you'll notice that there's a hard spot. And it doesn't want to go. And if you pull hard enough, it'll go past that hard spot, and then it'll be easy for a little bit longer, and then you'll hit another hard spot. What that means is that the cylinder's going, the piston's going up and down. When it gets to the top, it's compressing the air, right? So that's providing resistance, and that's where your hard spot is. It's at top dead center. So if you put the choke out, pull the choke out rather, you're choking off the air. This will actually restrict the air flow in and out of the engine to the extent where you should really notice the hardness of this when you pull it. If it's all the way out, sometimes on a hot day, it might be easy to pull. It might be hard to tell if there's a compression issue or not, but in cold weather, especially when you pull on this thing, it should definitely feel hard to pull. And if it doesn't, well, okay, so here's a foolproof way to tell. Forget all that stuff I just said. If you pull the spark plug out, okay, just remove it. Just get your socket and pull that out. You got a big hole going right into your cylinder, so there's no way that you're going to get any compression. If you pull the handle at that point, it should be super easy. It should be no effort at all. All right, so if it's super easy and then you go and put the plug back in and you pull it again and it's hard, okay, you've got good compression, so that fixes that. Now onto the spark, right? There's the spark plug, as I mentioned before. You've got points and condenser ignition inside this thing. If you pull the spark plug and look at it, if it looks like it's coated in soy sauce, like it's got this black residue on it, it means it's either been idling too long or running too rich or there's too much oil, something. It's fouled up the spark plug. So change the spark plug to a new one. Try to start it again. If it doesn't start, it could be your wiring, but if you believe that your wiring is good, it's probably the points and condensers are corroded and need to be serviced. Send it to anybody who works on saws and just ask them to open it up and service the points and condensers, and it should be good for another couple of years. At that point, your electrical system should be fine. Sometimes you get a bad coil or something, you're kind of fucked if that happens. It can be repaired again, but that's like not a very nice repair. I'm just telling you the easy stuff, okay? So change your spark plug, number one. That's the easiest thing to do. And your points and condensers would be the next thing to check if the spark plug doesn't fix the problem. What did we go through? We went through, oh yeah, and then air. So air just means, make sure that you don't have wood chips or obstructions or anything like that. Make sure your filter is relatively clean and that you don't have and make sure that your muffler isn't clogged up with garbage, and once you pull that off and look at the ports, you'll be able to see that the ports are clean as well, and if they're not, then and there are products that you can use to sort of clean these things up. You can run Seafoam, for example. You can run that into the gas a little bit to clean up the engine if you think there's deposits in the engine that's plugging it up. There's also this stuff called Engine Restore. I use it in my car. I put a little tiny bit of it, and I do stress the tiny bit because it's meant for 4 strokes. So don't necessarily follow my advice here, but I put a tiny bit of it in with my oil here and run it in through with the gas and the oil mixture, just to kind of like an additive package, if you want to think of it that way, for your oil, and it kind of restores some of the compression around the seals, but it's a temporary thing. So if you think you have a compression issue, you could try using some of that, but that's really not a long-term solution or anything like that. Other things that could break on the saw, that you would need to concern yourself with. The recoil sometimes gets stuck. If it gets stuck and doesn't recoil, you can just take some light oil, some lubricating oil, like or even some penetrating lubricant, like you know, a Move It or WD-40 or something. If you can get it in there and spray at the recoil spring. There's a recoil spring in the center that winds this thing back up. Sometimes it gets dirty and then the thing won't recoil. You can spray some penetrating lube in there, and that'll usually free that up. Over here, the saw. You don't want to run the chainsaw if the chain is tight. Chain should never be too tight. It should also not be too loose. If this thing's hanging down by ½ an inch, there's a good chance that the entire chain will derail from the bar, and then it'll come back and hit your hand and tear your arm off. Like, you don't want that, obviously. So make sure that it's not like hanging, you know, ½ an inch below the bar, but you also don't want it to be tight. Okay, so there's a screw. Every saw is different, but generally speaking, there's a screw somewhere. Oh wait, it's on this side. Sorry. In this case, it's this screw right here. There's a screw there. If you first, you have to get a socket and undo these two bolts to loosen the bar. Then you'll be able to use this screw to tighten or loosen the bar, which is to say that the bar will move back and forth according to how you turn that screw, and that will actually put more or less tension on this chain. The chain, you should be able to move it like this with your fingers. If you can't do that, it's too tight. So make sure that the chain has got the correct tension. Other than that, what else can go wrong with these things? Quite a few things can go wrong, but these are the popular ones. These are the ones that happen quite often, the most. So a two-stroke saw is a pretty simple mechanism at the end of the day. Aren't that many things to check. And if you want to see whether the carburetor, for example, is screwed up, if you suspect that the carburetor needs to be serviced, but you don't know for sure, one way to check it is to take some gas, suck up a little bit of gas, and then squirt it directly down the throat of the carburetor, okay? And then close the choke like this, and then pull the trigger a few times so that it falls into the cylinder. Then try to start the engine, okay? If the saw starts and runs for a few cycles and then shuts off, then you know that the saw isn't the problem, it's the carburetor that's not delivering fuel. That's a good way to check. Just squirt some gas down the carb, and the gas will be enough to start it for a few cycles. That'll be a surefire indicator that the carb is fucked.